So this is the beginning of war. As we get into the start of World War One, we have to begin here with the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand. He was the next in line to the throne at Austria-Hungary, and his assassin was from Serbia. And as he is killed, actually, there were a number of attempts on that exact same day on his life. There was a bomb that exploded that failed. It didn't work there. A couple other assassins tried to attack him, and it was not until this one that finally worked, where he is killed. And the blame is put on Serbia. And it was a man by the name of Gavrilo Princip, and he was from Serbia. And so, for that reason, Austria Hungary immediately declares war on Serbia, believing that it was their country that was behind the assassination. And so, that sparks everything that's going on. And as we talked about last time, the alliances that were happening were only building up toward the war, and all it was going to take was a one event to get everybody mobilized and get everybody involved in a war. And so that's exactly what happens when Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilizes its army. As you can see by the map here, Russia had interests near Serbia because they were involved in Romania, and they were afraid that if Austria-Hungary went to war against Serbia, that they may also press into Russian territory. So Russia gets its army ready. Now, let me be clear here. Russia does not declare war, and Russia does not invade anybody's territory, but just the act of mobilizing their army was enough to threaten Germany. Now, Germany, of course, was a little still was upset a little bit over the fact that they no longer had that alliance with Russia. They had allowed that to expire. And so I think Germany was perhaps looking for an excuse to get themselves going into war here. And this was all that they needed. And because of the fact that Russia was in an alliance with France, and the fact that France was on the other side of Germany, well, Germany had to declare war on France. Of course, that's the only logical thing to do. And so now Germany is looking at a war on two sides of their country. You look at the map there, they've got Russia on one side, they've got France on the other, and they're going to have to divide their army, which is going to be a difficult task. So as we get into the war, we begin to see the division of powers form. And I know we talked about the alliances last time, and you saw some of those things beginning to take place. Well, now that we actually get into war, sides have to determine whether they're actually going to jump into war with the Central or Allied powers, or they're going to stay neutral. And so we begin with the Central Powers. The Central Powers consist of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire is somewhat involved, but they really don't get very far in this war, and they're really a non-factor for the most part. And so typically we just look at Germany and Austria-Hungary as the two main Central Powers. Now on the other side, we've got the Allies. The Allies consist of Russia, Serbia, and France to begin with. And we're going to expand those, but for right now, those are the three countries involved. And as Germany looks at their situation, realizing that they have two sides to fight, they have to come up with a very strong battle plan. It's going to be really hard for them to split their army and fight on both sides of their country. So they develop what is called the Schlieffen Plan. That's a great word. Just say it out loud. It'll make you feel good. And it also kind of spray out. If you say it right, if you're not spraying out when you say it, you're probably not saying it well. So we have the Schlieffen Plan. Here's what it was. The plan was, let's go after France first, because everybody knows that France is the weaker power. And so the plan was going to focus all of their military on France for 40 days. Now, that's what Germany thought, that they could defeat France that quickly, 40 days. And then once they conquer Paris and they get into France and they have nothing to worry about on that side, now they can move over and focus entirely on Russia. And it made sense because Russia is, while they're on the border, their military is quite a ways away and their capital city is a long ways away. So it was going to take them time to get there. So if they could defeat France there in 40 days, then they would be successful. Now, there are a couple problems here. First of all, in order to get to France, they had to go through Belgium. and Belgium was a neutral country. And so, in order for them to execute this plan and to get straight to France, they were going to have to violate that neutrality. And that is going to upset Great Britain. When Germany invades a neutral country and a country that is allied with the British now have to get involved. And that is something that I don't believe that Germany really counted on, or they thought that Great Britain would get involved in this over tiny little Belgium. And yet they did. And so that's exactly why Great Britain enters the war. It was not because they were coming to the aid of France, although that is a side effect. It was really because of the violation of Belgium's neutrality and the breaking of a treaty that Belgium had had with the Germans earlier on. Well, there are a number of things that happen, and if you want to dig deeper into this, I would welcome you to do so. We're just going to hit some of the big highlights, and I'd love to spend more time, but you got things to do, I've got things to do, and so if you're interested, jump in on your own. The Battle of the Marne is one of the most significant of all the battles here when it comes to the fighting in France. So Germany advances very quickly through the Schlieffen Plan into France. However, they get right up to Paris, but they cannot take the capital city. And France does everything possible to make sure that they protect their capital, and they even go so far as to take any sort of transportation, taxi cabs, private vehicles, anything that they could to transport soldiers and able bodied men out to the front lines just outside of France to hold off the Germans. And it worked. And when they did, they dug in trenches and created a stalemate just outside of Paris. And this was successful enough to keep the Germans from advancing to the capital city and executing the Schlieffen Plan like they had hoped. And when they dug in those trenches, the Germans knew that they were not going to be done in 40 days. Well, the war is going to continue in the east. Germany is going to be left with no choice but to turn toward Russia as well, and they have to split their army. And so Russia earns a lot of victories early on in the east. There were a lot of easy battles that they were able to take in German and Austrian territory because of the fact that German attention was focused over on the French side. And so we have Paul von Hindenburg, who represents Germany, and he is the first one to gain a victory on the German side against the Russians. And it's one of those moments where it seems as though once Russia lost its momentum and the Germans gained one victory, that's all it took to turn the Russians back. And they were really never a factor again in the war from this point forward. And part of that is due to what was going on back home with Russia. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. So we look in the events throughout the war, a couple things that we need to pay attention to. First of all, the West isn't entrenched in a stalemate. There is nobody winning either side of the war. And because neither side could get through, they dug into those trenches, and the trenches became a place for protection, but with a major cost with that, because those trenches were out in the middle of these fields, and it was day after day after day, including harsh rains, and the trenches started filling with water. And one of the dangers and the problems with the trenches is something called trench foot. And this is one of the most disgusting and gross things that was a repercussion of the trenches, is that as these guys were walking through 12 to 16 inches of water, sometimes more, including their own filth and sewage. There were no restrooms anywhere to be found. It was just there in the trench. Disease spread. And not to mention, if you think about, if you sit in the bathtub or the pool too long, your skin starts to get soft and shrivel up. Imagine that day in and day out, never drying out, and you're in the same boots, the same socks. Got so bad that some guys even went to pull off their boots, and as they did, the skin just slid off with their boots. Hope you're not eating right now. So it became very hard to conquer new land because of the trenches, and it led to a war of attrition, which meant that neither side was gaining anything, and it was a war that was set up to outlast the other one. It was not a war that was going to be fought to the victor, whoever could win the battles. It was going to be whoever didn't give up first. And that's what the War of Attrition is all about. Well, this is the first time that we see Italy get involved. Now, Italy at one time had been allied with Germany, but through a number of circumstances and unfulfilled promises, Italy kind of fades to the background. And the Allies take the opportunity to scoop up Italy when they promise them things like land and even loans that if the Allies were to win and they were a part of that, then they would receive some of those benefits. So Italy was really only in it for the stuff. They didn't have a vested interest in the cause of the war. They just wanted the spoils of war. And as they saw the Allies begin to gain momentum, they said, let's jump on that bandwagon. Maybe we'll get something out of it. Now, as we look at the war, there were a number of new weapons that came into play here. And hang on, I'm going to move that. I'm not sure why there's something in front of the screen. Let's see if we can get rid of that. There we go. That's better. A few new weapons that we see come into the forefront here in World War I. The machine gun is one of those. We talked about that in class a little bit. It could fire off about 450 rounds every minute. We also see the flamethrower. That's one of my favorite new gadgets of war. I mean, these guys, they strapped gasoline to the back of their backpack and they lit a flame to a hose, and the rest is history. I mean, this is an incredibly dangerous and yet pretty cool tool, but they would use that down in the trenches, and as they would march close enough to those trenches, they would just shoot those flamethrowers down in there, and it's something you didn't want to get close to. We talked about poison gas already in class, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there. There was chlorine gas, there was mustard gas, and a couple other variations, but the mustard gas was the most famous and most devastating. Now, it really wasn't that deadly, but it was extremely painful and debilitating for the soldiers that were affected by it. Then there's also Big Bertha. Now, Big Bertha was the largest gun that had ever been created to that point. It could fire these big shells, 75 to 80 miles. And this was an incredible advantage in the war if you had one. Now, it was not very accurate, but it could shoot it pretty far. The development of the tank, though it was not extremely effective, it was still a new technology and did offer some benefit. It's definitely going to be a major player in World War II. Airplanes were used for the very first time. In fact, we have Baron von Richthofen. His last name is spelled Richthhofen. He is known as the Red Baron, and he was the most successful of all of the World War I pilots. He flew for Germany, and he is extremely famous and had a lot of kills and was very skilled at what he did. And then there's the Zeppelin. Now, the Zeppelin is like a blimp. These were used for dropping bombs or for flying over and spying on the enemy. They were fairly effective, perhaps kind of like the modern day drone, much slower and much larger. But unfortunately, they were also extremely flammable, and so perhaps not the greatest assignment if you are part of the Air Force. And one of the things that we do see change here in World War I is that we see something called total war. This is where everything is fair game. The citizens are no longer protected. And so we now have less human dignity involved in the war. We have more all is fair in war mentality. If it means that it's going to give me an advantage, I can do about whatever. And so that is definitely a change from previous wars. Now, out in the water, there were a few other advancements. We see the first time underwater boats. They called them U-boats for short. Germany was the first one to develop these and to use them effectively in war. And so the Germans are going to set a blockade against the British. And essentially, they would take all of their underwater boats and line them up outside of the British ports to make sure that the British ships couldn't come in or go out. And they didn't have the technology to see below the water. They didn't know when those U-boats were going to pop up and were going to fire at their ships. Well, that leads me to talk about the Lusitania. Lusitania was a British ship that was a passenger and cargo ship that traveled back and forth between England and the United States. And on May 7th of 1915, it was traveling from the United States to England, and 128 Americans were on board that ship when it was sunk by a German U-boat. Now, I know this is not American history, but it involves bringing a major player into the war. So America had denied getting involved in this war for a long, long time. And they had tried to remain neutral. They had tried to supply things to both sides of the war, both to Germany and to Great Britain. They wanted to keep those trading lines open. The problem was that Germany was so far inland that it made it almost impossible to actually get supplies into Germany because of the war going on. And so most of those items ended up going to Great Britain. And the Germans said, yeah, right, like you're really neutral. You keep getting all this stuff to the British. And so the Germans started sinking ships that they suspected had military supplies that were being smuggled into Great Britain. Well, the Lusitania was one of those ships. And it was suspected of smuggling supplies into Great Britain. And it was denied that they had any. They said, no, this is a passenger ship. And lo and behold, yeah, there were guns and there were other weapons and there was artillery on that ship. So in reality, the Germans were justified in sinking this. But because 128 Americans were on that ship, it launched a war sentiment in the United States. And it is one of the things that eventually does bring the United States into war, along with Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare, in where they declared that any ship that passes inside of the war zone would be sunk without warning. So nobody's going to be able to put limits or place any sort of restrictions on them. The problem is, how do you define where the war zone is out in the water? And that was the big question that the Americans had, especially when it came to the Lusitania. And they said, Germany's just trying to take over way too much, trying to get too much power. Let's go after the Germans. Well, about this time, Russia also drops out of the war for personal reasons. So we need to talk a little bit about what's happening in Russia. So, as you remember from Russian history, the Russians are controlled by a ruling family known as the Tsars, or the Russian Caesar. And for hundreds of years, the Russians have been ruled by several different families. And in particular, it was the Romanov family here that had been ruling for quite some time. And Nicholas II was the king, or the Tsar, of Russia. But because of some of the uprising and turmoil that was happening in Russia, he abdicated the throne. And that meant that there was no ruler in power in Russia. Now, there are a few other details involved in his abdication. Um, a lot of speculation that the communists were behind all of this and that um, they were forcing him to do so. And his family is brutally murdered as well. And there's a whole backstory behind that. I'd encourage you to research a little bit more into that as well. But Russia really was not prepared to go into war. And so when they get involved in this war, they want out as fast as they can. And I told you about their retreat earlier uh, after losing one of those initial battles, and they're just going to continue retreating. And with the Red Scare, the Red idea of communism coming into Russia, they begin to pull back and just focus on things back at home. The economy is not good. It's not able to keep up with the demands of war. And so because of that, the people are begging for a change in their government. They're begging for something different to make life better. And that's where Vladimir Lenin comes to power. And he brings in this idea of communism that, well, that the people should run the government and that the people should have equal and fair opportunities for bread and for work and for wealth, and all of these great promises that come along with communism. And the people turned to Vladimir Lenin as their savior, as their person to rescue them out of extreme poverty. And so they put him in power, and Germany encourages Russia, and Russia agrees to sign a treaty to officially pull Russia out of the war, which means that now Germany doesn't have to worry about the Russians at all. And so the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed, and as they get Russia out of there, Germany's doing a silent cheer, and they are all excited because now they can just focus on the rest of the Allies. However, they are going to bring in the United States. So America joins in because of unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of Lusitania. Uh, well, in fact, I'm going to bring that up here in just a moment. We talked in class about Woodrow Wilson and his Declaration of Neutrality, how he promised to keep them out of the war. Then all these other things happened. So we mentioned unrestricted submarine warfare, the common interest between Britain and France, the fact that they were of like-minded governments and philosophy, and then, of course, the Zimmerman Note. And that was just a boneheaded mistake by the Germans to try to get Mexico to join in a war with the United States, and it just blew up. And so the United States was also interested in maintaining the balance of power, not allowing Germany to take control of too much of Europe, because if they did, that was going to affect America's relationship with many of these European countries. And so for these four reasons, the United States joins into the war on April 6th of 1917. One of America's most powerful and best military leaders of World War I was John J. Pershing, nicknamed Blackjack. And he revived the Allies as he brought the American troops in. Many of the Allies had been beaten down by the Germans and had been discouraged. And here comes John J. Pershing, encouraging them to push forward, bringing in fresh troops. And as the United States gets involved late into this war, there's not a lot of extremely significant battles that the United States is involved in. But Chateau Thierry is one of them. And this was one of the turning points of the war, where the Allies defeated the Central Powers and were able to push them backward. And it's from this point forward that the Allies are going to gain more and more momentum and eventually lead them into victory. The Argonne Offensive was yet another one of those major battles. The United States was involved in pushing the Germans back through the Argonne Forest and gaining significant ground here that is eventually going to force Germany back into their own territory. And for the most part, at the end of all of this, most of Europe and the United States just wants Germany to go back to where they were before all this started. They're not interested in taking over Germany. And so once they get them back into their borders, that is where we get to the armistice. Now, notice here that armistice is the word armistice. It is not the word treaty. It's not the word ceasefire, although that's really what it becomes. An armistice is an agreement to put down your weapons. It's an agreement to begin the peace negotiations. And November 11th of 1918, this becomes known as Armistice Day in the United States. And today we celebrate that as Veterans Day. And so they begin the pursuit of peace, which we will talk about another time.